Alright, last time we had this VS come in as a rolling shell, and we repainted the engine bay, fitted the motor and gearbox, along with the extractors. And in this video we'll get everything else done, except for the exhaust, because the customer will be getting that done elsewhere. So we'll get the transcooler mounted and get the cooler lines routed to the gearbox. The 4L60 the customer is using is out of a VY Commodore, so it's got the later model clip-on transcooler lines, and I've routed them on the outside of the chassis rail up to the front of the car, and where the hardline ends we've run some rubber hose up to the transcooler. The customer supplied a single row PWR transcooler for this job, and I've mounted it in the factory location with a couple of straps of steel, and I was able to neatly run the rubber hose up to the side. With that complete, we'll move on to the wiring loom. This is a standard Ls1 harness out of a VX Commodore, and it's been modified to suit the VS body, but since the customer's gone with a high ram manifold, we're going to have to modify the centre section. As you can see, the TPS and the IAC are now in the centre of the motor instead of the front. So I'll have to cut open this section of the loom and move the TPS and the IAC around the back. The rest of the loom can stay as it is, except for these couple of wires we'll have to hook up when it's in the car. But I'll cut this open and get it modified and come back once it's done. So I removed all the old tape and sleeving off the loom and relocated the TPS and IAC wiring down the back here. This should be fairly hidden now behind the engine and just come up to the throttle body. I also added some length to the intake air temp sensor, and this will just run up and sit inside the air cleaner. I also moved the earth from the front of the head down the back here just to neaten it up. And now with those couple of modifications done, I can now fit the loom to the engine. Now I've got the loom fitted to the engine and all of the sensors plugged in. Like we went over earlier, the air intake temp sensor will come up and sit in the air cleaner somewhere around here. I've turned the injectors around so the plugs in the loom are on the inside of the rail, just to neaten that up a little bit as well. Like I said, this loom was modified to suit a VS Commodore, so it's all pretty much plug and play. And you can see the bulk of the loom runs over here on the firewall, and the ECU is located inside the car. To get the throttle hooked up, I've used a VS V6 throttle cable, and that fit the manifold side perfectly, and because it's for a VS Commodore, it fits on the inside, no worries. Also, while I was here, I fitted the radiator, and I've used the standard VXSS crossover pipe and screwed that to the radiator support. We'll move on to the cooling system shortly, but for now we'll finish up the wiring by getting the battery cabling done. We've got some black 32 square mil battery cable and attached that to the chassis rail and then over to the engine block. I've run a section of the same 32 square mil battery cable from the alternator over to the starter motor, and then from the starter motor I've got the other cable that runs up into the inside of the car through the tunnel. This section is a little bit closer to the exhaust, so I fitted it with some fire sleeve. On the inside of the car, the cable runs up through the tunnel and then underneath the carpet and along the sill panel here, and then runs all the way down the back, under the back seat and into the boot. On the inside of the boot I've got it running underneath the carpet here and then down the side to where I fitted a battery box, and also used another section of the black battery cable for the earth. Moving on to the cooling system, the customer supplied us this nice shiny silicone hose kit for a VXSS. This will fit for the majority of it, we'll have to cut some down, but it should be sweet. I'll also be using the bypass adapter for the bleeder pipe on the head. But we'll get all this cut up and get it fitted to the car, and we'll see how it looks. That was easy enough. I had to cut a section out of the top hose and a little bit off some of the others. I also plumbed in a new 4-way heater tap and fitted an airflow swivel thermostat housing just to move the bottom hose away from the chassis rail. I didn't have to cut any off this side of the bottom hose. With this other short section I had to cut pretty much in half. And a small section 8mm heater hose from the head bleed pipe to the bypass adapter. I've also mounted this small aluminium overflow tank on the inside of the front bumper here. And that was just to clean up the engine bay as well. It might not be the most convenient, but once the grill's back in you won't see it at all. And that finishes up the cooling system. There is a couple other things we need to do, like plumb up the whole fuel system, swap out the fuel pump for something that's going to support this motor, fit an EFI fuel rig down the back. Also this brake booster hose needs to be plumbed up to the back of the manifold. Plumb up the PCV system, fit all of the coil packs, plugs, leads, oxy sensors, all that kind of good stuff. I'm not sure if I showed this last time, but we'll quickly go over the power steering system. It's still running the factory VXSS power steering pump, bracket and reservoir. Also the high pressure line is just the standard one as well, and just use some 10mm transcooler hose for the return line. The high and low pressure lines run underneath and bolt to the sump like factory, and then on the other side you just have to bend the end a little bit where it goes into the rack. The low pressure return line goes from the factory hard line here and then runs across and up to the reservoir. Up next I'll be doing the fuel system. Since the customer's gone for a high ram manifold and billet rails, we'll be plumbing it all up with some braided hose and fittings. The plan is to plumb the rails together at the back using this right angle, straight and T-piece. We'll also use these two blanking plugs to blank off the front of the rails for a bit neater look. And once the rails are plumbed together, the T-piece should be on this side, and we'll use the 180 to plumb it back into the fuel line. So I'll go and cut some braided line now and stab my fingers a little bit. I'll also go underneath the car and fit up the fuel regulator. The customer's informed me he's already got a decent sized fuel pump in there, so there's no need to touch that. And we've mounted up a fuel regulator underneath here on the rail. Plumbed up the feed from the fuel pump to the bottom along with the fuel filter and the return from the top. Now the reg's all plumbed up, I've also fitted up the bungs to the front of the rails here, and I bent the factory fuel lines on an angle to face off to the side. They make an adapter from the factory rail to a -6 connector, and then they've plumbed that over to the 180 and also plumbed up the back of the rails together with this T-piece. All that's left to do now is hook up a fuel pressure gauge and set the fuel pressure at the regulator, and then I'll be done with the fuel system as well. It's all coming together and looking quite nice. I think the next thing I'll do is mount the shifter and hook up the shifter cable. I've cut the floor pan and mounted the B&M shifter in the drop box. I've already got the cable adjusted to length. We'll jump underneath the car and take a look at that. You can see where I've had to cut the floor pan for the drop box. The cable runs around from the front and down to the gearbox. When you buy the B&M shifter, it comes with all the supplied bracketry so that you don't have to make anything. Also, while I was underneath here, I fitted up the heat shields to the steering rack and also one in between the starter motor and the extractors. On the other side there's one on the steering rack as well, also over the transcooler lines, and one up onto the crank trigger. It's important you do put one on the crank trigger because I don't know how many times I've seen that section of the loom just melted. I've got the center console all bolted back in now, and I spent a fair bit of time getting the cuts around the shifter and the reverse lockout correct, but I'm pretty happy with it. It all seems to work quite well. Now that's finished, I'll get some fluids in it and we'll move on to the first startup. The customer's going to relocate the fuse box, so we've just got it sitting in place for now with a rag underneath it so it won't scratch the strut tower. Start her up. Unfortunately, we have to leave things here since the customer's got to take the car away and get the exhaust done still. He will be coming back for a dyno later, so I will include that in a video at some stage. And if you stuck around to the end of the video, as always, thanks for watching.